The train was a picture of calm, its gentle rocking lulling passengers into a sense of security. But Miss Marple knew better. The stillness in the air, the barely audible rustle of Mrs. Carrington's bag, the fleeting glance exchanged between strangers. Everything was a sign. Something was about to break. Somewhere in the shadows of this seemingly peaceful journey, a secret was stirring, and it wouldn't be long before the quiet was shattered. The question was, who would be left standing when it was? Chapter 1. A silent train journey. The evening was a gentle one, the kind of dusk that clung to the earth like a soft blanket, casting the world in a sleepy haze. Miss Jane Marple sat at her usual spot by the window in the near-empty compartment of the London to Countryside train. The cool autumn air, filtering through the crack of the slightly ajar window, carried with it the scent of fallen leaves and the distant sound of a church bell tolling the hour. She adjusted her shawl with a quick, practiced motion, settling in with a small, discreet book of crosswords. It was not unusual for Miss Marple to find herself travelling alone. Indeed, she preferred it. Her sharp eyes and even sharper mind often found more peace in observing the world around her than participating in it. The steady rhythm of the train's wheels, clicking on the tracks, provided a comforting backdrop, lulling her into the kind of calm that only a quiet journey could bring. She had taken this same route countless times, but tonight something felt different. A faint undercurrent of tension that prickled her senses, though she couldn't yet put a finger on why. Her compartment, unlike others, was near silent. The train was mostly empty, save for one other occupant, Mrs. Penelope Carrington. The woman was sitting across from Miss Marple, clutching a small leather bag in her lap, her eyes nervously darting between the window and the compartment door. Miss Marple had seen her type before. Nervous, uneasy, someone with a burden they were trying desperately to hide. A polite exchange of glances was the extent of their initial conversation, but Miss Marple didn't need words to understand. She could see the telltale signs of someone struggling with something unseen. Mrs. Carrington's hands fidgeted incessantly, turning the clasp of her bag over and over. Her lips parted in what seemed like a never-ending attempt to say something, but always stopped short. The quiet was thick, almost oppressive. It was only when Mrs. Carrington caught Miss Marple's gaze that she finally spoke. "Oh, I do beg your pardon," she said, her voice fluttering with uncertainty. Well, I suppose I'm not used to travelling alone." Miss Marple smiled kindly, offering a polite nod. "It can be a bit daunting, can't it? Travelling alone, I mean, especially in the evening. But I do find that the solitude has its charm." "Quite so," Mrs. Carrington replied quickly, as if she were grateful for the small piece of reassurance. I was just thinking about things. You know how it is." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she studied the woman. Mrs. Carrington's thin, trembling fingers now rested on her bag, as though she were unwilling to let it go for even a moment. The bag was quite small. Too small, in fact, to hold anything that could be of much value. Yet there was something about the way Mrs. Carrington clutched it, as though it held the most important secret in the world. "Where are you headed, if you don't mind me asking?" Miss Marple inquired gently, trying to break the stillness. "Oh, just a small place in the countryside," Mrs. Carrington replied, her voice growing a little quieter. "I thought I'd take a short break just for a few days. A change of scenery, I suppose. Something to clear the mind." Miss Marple nodded, feigning interest, but her mind was already at work. There was something about the woman's tone, something clipped, as if she were trying too hard to sound casual. And then there was the bag. The way it never left her side, the way Mrs. Carrington was constantly shifting it from one knee to the other, as though it were too precious to let out of her sight. "May I ask what's inside?" Miss Marple ventured, her voice light and casual. "A gift for someone, perhaps?" Mrs. Carrington's eyes widened, and her hand instinctively clutched the bag tighter. Oh no. Nothing like that. Just some private things. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. She hadn't been asking out of genuine curiosity. She was merely trying to engage the woman, trying to ease her into conversation. But Mrs. Carrington's reaction told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. Private things. The woman had said it so quickly, so defensively, that it only raised more questions than answers. What could be so private, so important, that Mrs. Carrington would go to such lengths to protect it? The thought lingered in Miss Marple's mind, but she did not press her further. After all, not everyone was ready to share their secrets, and Miss Marple knew all too well that some things were better left to unravel in their own time. The train sped onward, the rhythmic chug of the engine beginning to lull the passengers into a trance-like calm. Miss Marple returned to her crossword puzzle, but her eyes occasionally flicked over to Mrs. Carrington. She had grown more agitated now, shifting in her seat, tapping her foot, and casting worried glances at the door. For a brief moment, Miss Marple wondered if the woman was simply a nervous traveller. But then the train passed through a dark tunnel, and Miss Marple could see the reflection of Mrs. Carrington's face in the window, her features drawn tight, her eyes wide, as though she had just heard something from outside their compartment. It was the briefest flicker of fear, but Miss Marple noticed. The train emerged from the darkness of the tunnel, and the light seemed to calm the woman once more. But Miss Marple's suspicions had been raised. There was something about Mrs. Carrington's unease that didn't add up. What was she so afraid of? The train continued on its path, the faint hum of conversation from distant compartments filling the air. But in this small, quiet compartment, only the rhythmic sound of the train wheels kept the silence from becoming unbearable. Miss Marple's mind raced. This was no ordinary journey. Something was amiss, and she had a feeling it was not going to take long before the quiet began to unravel. Chapter 2. The Stranger's Glance. The rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels against the tracks filled the air as Miss Marple sat, carefully observing the quiet compartment, her eyes flicking between the crossword puzzle in her lap and the nervous figure of Mrs. Carrington opposite her. The train swayed gently with each curve of the tracks, the soft lighting casting long shadows across the seats, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. Despite the calm exterior, there was an undeniable tension in the air, something Miss Marple couldn't quite ignore. Just as she was about to return to her puzzle, the faint sound of footsteps echoed down the narrow corridor outside their compartment. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and a man appeared in the doorway. He was tall, well-dressed in a dark suit with a faint air of authority, but it was the sharpness in his eyes that caught Miss Marple's attention. He was looking past her, his gaze flickering to the side as if searching for something, or someone. It was a brief glance, but it was deliberate and intense, and Miss Marple had the unsettling sense that it had been aimed right at her. The man, however, did not seem to notice her studying him. His eyes quickly moved to Mrs. Carrington, who was sitting still in her seat, her hands tightly gripping the edge of her leather bag. The man hesitated, then without a word, stepped inside the compartment and settled into the seat opposite Mrs. Carrington, his presence suddenly making the small space feel even smaller. Miss Marple observed this quietly, her curiosity piqued. There was no greeting, no polite small talk. The man simply sat and looked out the window, his jaw clenched as though deep in thought. Mrs. Carrington, on the other hand, was visibly unsettled. Her fingers clenched and unclenched around the strap of her bag, her eyes darting from the man to the window, as if trying to avoid his gaze. A heavy silence descended between them, one that Miss Marple found far from coincidental. She noted the subtle way Mrs. Carrington seemed to shrink further into her seat, her posture stiff, as though the man's mere presence made her uncomfortable. It was then that Miss Marple noticed the faintest tremor in Mrs. Carrington's hand, as she attempted to adjust her bag. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, her keen eyes narrowing as she studied the man's reflection in the window. She could tell from his posture and the tension in his movements that he was not the type to casually board a train without purpose. This was no ordinary traveller, he was a man on a mission, and Miss Marple suspected that mission had something to do with Mrs. Carrington. At that moment, the man turned his head just enough to meet Mrs. Carrington's gaze. His eyes were cold, calculating, and for a split second Miss Marple thought she saw a flash of recognition pass between them, though neither of them moved to acknowledge it. The man's lips barely parted, his words spoken in the quietest of murmurs. "Are we really going to play this game, Mrs. Carrington?" His voice was low, firm, and authoritative. Mrs. Carrington flinched, her lips trembling. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, her voice breaking under the pressure. Miss Marple watched closely as Mrs. Carrington's fingers curled tighter around her bag, and her eyes flickered to the door as though contemplating a quick escape. But she remained rooted in place, unable or unwilling to move. The man's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. He leaned back slightly, as though savouring the discomfort he had caused. "Don't play the innocent with me. You know exactly what I'm referring to." He glanced briefly at Miss Marple, his gaze flicking over her with a slight, dismissive air, as though she were little more than a harmless old lady. "I'm sure our friend here won't mind if we talk openly. After all, it's not as if she's going to be of much help." The comment stung more than Miss Marple let on, though she didn't show it. It was clear now that this man, whoever he was, believed himself to be in control of the situation, and he had clearly underestimated her. But Miss Marple's sharp gaze never wavered, and she watched as the scene unfolded with a quiet, calculating focus. Mrs. Carrington seemed to shrink even further, her eyes desperately searching the compartment as though hoping for a means of escape. But there was no escape. The man had already cornered her with his words. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know where it is. You have to believe me." The stranger's expression hardened. "I'm not interested in your excuses. If you don't have it with you, I'll find it myself," he said, his tone like ice. He stood abruptly, his movements sharp and quick. "You won't be able to hide for much longer. You can only run so far." Without another word, he turned and strode toward the door of the compartment. But just before exiting, he glanced over his shoulder and fixed Miss Marple with a piercing look. "This conversation isn't over," he said coldly, as if daring her to challenge him. The door slid shut with a soft click as he disappeared down the hallway, leaving Miss Marple alone with Mrs. Carrington. A heavy silence followed, the only sound the distant hum of the train as it rumbled along the tracks. Mrs. Carrington sat motionless for a moment, her eyes wide with fear, her face pale as though all the colour had drained from it. She was trembling slightly, and the bag in her lap seemed almost to vibrate with the intensity of her fear. Finally, Miss Marple spoke, her voice gentle but steady. "I believe, Mrs. Carrington, that it is time for you to tell me what's going on. You've been carrying a heavy burden, and it's clear that you can't run from it forever." Mrs. Carrington swallowed hard and with a shaky breath finally spoke. He's not wrong. I am hiding something. Something very dangerous." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving Mrs. Carrington. "And you're afraid it will catch up with you, aren't you? But there's more to this than you're telling me. You must trust me if you want any hope of escaping what's coming for you." For a brief moment, Mrs. Carrington hesitated, but then, as though the weight of her secret had finally broken her, she leaned forward and whispered urgently, "The package. It's not what it seems. It's not just a gift, Miss Marple, it's a key. Something they would do anything to get back. Miss Marple's mind raced, but she remained calm, her voice soft. A key to what, Mrs. Carrington? Mrs. Carrington's eyes flicked nervously toward the door, her voice trembling. I can't say. Not yet. But they'll come for it. They'll come for me, and I won't be able to outrun them forever. The train continued its journey through the night, its steady rhythm now punctuated by the ominous weight of Mrs. Carrington's words. Miss Marple's thoughts were already in motion, calculating, analyzing. There was more to this than she had initially suspected, but the pieces were starting to come together, and with each passing moment, Miss Marple was certain that she was closer to uncovering the truth behind the mysterious package and the dangerous game that had begun. The game was far from over. Chapter 3. The Package. The train swayed gently as it made its way through the moonlit countryside. The rhythmic sound of the wheels on the track was soothing, yet the tension in the compartment had only deepened. Mrs. Carrington, who had been clenching her leather bag so tightly, had finally spoken, just enough to stir Miss Marple's suspicions further. A key to something dangerous? Miss Marple's curiosity had ignited, but she could feel the burden of whatever Mrs. Carrington was hiding pressing down on both of them. Mrs. Carrington was sitting very still now, her back straight, her fingers curled tightly around her bag, as though it were her only shield against an unseen threat. She had lowered her voice to a near whisper, and Miss Marple could see that her earlier bravado had evaporated entirely. The woman looked fragile, like someone caught in a storm, unable to escape. Miss Marple remained silent for a moment, allowing the words to sink in. She had learned long ago that people didn't always speak the truth in one go. There was often a layer of fear, shame, or pride that prevented them from telling the whole story. She had to tread carefully. Mrs. Carrington, Miss Marple began softly, her tone calm and steady. You mentioned a key, something dangerous, but you haven't told me what it unlocks. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Mrs. Carrington's eyes flickered toward the door again, her breathing shallow. She was trapped, Miss Marple could tell. She had been running from something, someone, and it had finally cornered her. But how much of her story could be believed, and why had she come onto this particular train under such suspicious circumstances? I can't say much more yet, Miss Marple, Mrs. Carrington whispered, her voice quivering, but I'll explain what I can. The package. It's not just some trivial thing. It's information that could ruin lives, including mine. If it gets into the wrong hands, it could destroy everything. Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her gaze softening. I understand, Mrs. Carrington, but I assure you the sooner you tell me everything, the sooner I can help. Running and hiding will only make things worse, won't it? Mrs. Carrington swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously around the compartment as though seeking a way out. The man you saw earlier, his name is Thomas Gregory. He's not who he seems. He's been after this package for a long time. He's a part of something much bigger, something illegal, and he'll stop at nothing to get it. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. She had suspected as much. Gregory was no ordinary traveller. His cold, calculating demeanour and the way he had behaved toward Mrs. Carrington had screamed of ulterior motives. He wasn't simply looking for a lost item. He was hunting for something very specific. Is it blackmail, Mrs. Carrington? Miss Marple asked gently. Has Gregory been threatening you? Mrs. Carrington nodded slowly, her lips trembling. Yes, it's blackmail. But not just that. I was once involved in a business venture, a legitimate one at first. But then things went wrong. Very wrong. Gregory, he was one of the investors. I thought it was just business, but it turned out that he and his associates were involved in far more than I could ever have imagined. They were laundering money, using the company as a front for something much more sinister. And when things started to unravel, Gregory used that information to control me. He threatened to expose everything. Miss Marple listened carefully, her mind working to process the information. Blackmail, money laundering, these were dangerous things indeed. But there was more. There had to be more to the story, something that connected all the dots. Did you try to go to the authorities? Miss Marple asked, her voice still gentle, though her mind was already racing ahead. I tried, Mrs. Carrington whispered, but Gregory had eyes everywhere. I was trapped. I couldn't prove anything, and I was terrified that if I went to the police, it would all come back to me. I'd be implicated. So, I did what I thought was best. I gathered the evidence and tried to keep it hidden, but Gregory found out. He knew that I was trying to get away from him. That's why he's been after me. And now... She paused, a shiver running through her. Now he's closer than ever. Miss Marple's mind was piecing things together, but there were still many gaps. What exactly was in the package? Why had Mrs. Carrington brought it with her? And why was she now so fearful that Gregory would find it? You said the package is a key, Miss Marple prodded. What does it unlock? Mrs. Carrington hesitated, her fingers drumming nervously on the leather bag. The package is a set of documents, financial records, transactions, the kind of evidence that could bring down an entire network of criminals. But there's something else. Something Gregory doesn't know. The documents aren't the only thing in that package. There's a note, a confession. My confession. Miss Marple's interest piqued. A confession? To what? Mrs. Carrington's face flushed, and her voice dropped to barely a whisper. To my involvement in the whole thing. To everything. I didn't know what I was getting into when I first got involved, but I helped them. I helped Gregory and his people launder money. I thought I was just doing my job, that I was just a small part of a much bigger operation. But I was wrong. And now, that confession is the only thing keeping Gregory from completely destroying me. He wants it, Miss Marple. He wants that confession. It was all starting to make sense. At least, the pieces were coming together. But there were still too many questions left unanswered. Why had Mrs. Carrington chosen this particular moment to reveal the truth? And why had she brought the documents with her on this train? Why didn't you destroy the confession? Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but probing. Why keep it? I couldn't, Mrs. Carrington whispered, her voice breaking. It's the only thing left that could protect me. Without it, I'm as good as dead. If Gregory gets his hands on it, he'll use it to ruin my life, and I can't let that happen. But now, I'm running out of time. I don't know how much longer I can keep it hidden. Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes narrowing as she took in the woman's words. The confession, the documents. It was all too convenient, too perfect. And yet, Miss Marple knew better than to take everything at face value. There were gaps, inconsistencies, things that didn't add up. Mrs. Carrington, Miss Marple said softly, I understand your fear, but there's something else you need to tell me. What is it you're not saying? What's truly in the package? Mrs. Carrington's eyes flicked toward the door again, her face pale with terror. I can't, she whispered. Not yet, but you'll see soon enough. When we reach the station, everything will change. Miss Marple's mind was racing, trying to piece the puzzle together. But one thing was certain. The package was far more than a simple set of documents. It was the key to something much larger, and Miss Marple was about to uncover the truth, whether Mrs. Carrington was ready to face it or not. As the train continued to rumble down the tracks, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Gregory. He was already looking for the package, and it wouldn't be long before he found out where it was hidden. The real question was, Could Miss Marple unravel the mystery before the secrets inside the package were exposed? And would Mrs. Carrington live long enough to see it through? The game was afoot, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover every last detail. Chapter 4. A sudden incident. The gentle hum of the train was a constant backdrop as Miss Marple sat in silence, her mind still occupied with the troubling details Mrs. Carrington had just revealed. The confession, the documents, Gregory's pursuit, it was all part of a larger, dangerous game that was playing out right before her. The thought of Gregory, that cold, calculating figure, loomed large in Miss Marple's mind. The man's intent was clear. He was not simply interested in the package. He wanted to control the woman, force her into silence, and make sure she never exposed the web of lies they were all tangled in. Yet despite all the pieces falling into place, something was still missing. What had brought Mrs. Carrington to this point? Why had she not gone to the police, or at least sought out another form of protection? Her actions didn't match the level of danger she was describing. Miss Marple shifted in her seat and glanced over at Mrs. Carrington, who was still clutching her bag, her fingers trembling lightly. The woman's face was pale, and the nervous energy that radiated from her was palpable. The fear in her eyes had not abated, but it was clear she was too afraid to speak any further. "Perhaps you should rest for a moment, Mrs. Carrington," Miss Marple said gently, her voice a calm anchor in the growing tension. "The journey is long, and I'm certain you'll feel better with a little rest." But before Mrs. Carrington could respond, the sudden screech of the train's brakes pierced the calm. The rattling of the carriage shook Miss Marple out of her thoughts, and she immediately turned toward the door as the train lurched to a sudden halt. A low murmur of confusion spread through the other compartments. Mrs. Carrington's face paled even further, and her eyes darted to the window, her breath quickening. "What's happening?" Mrs. Carrington whispered, her voice on the edge of panic. "Why has the train stopped?" Miss Marple, ever the observer, remained calm, her eyes narrowing as she noted the worried expressions of the conductor and other staff members passing by. From the distant clamour of voices, she caught snippets of words like accident and emergency ahead. The tension in the air grew palpable as the train remained stationary in the dark, silent stretch of the countryside. Moments later, the door to their compartment slid open, and a young conductor, pale-faced and breathless, appeared in the doorway. "Ladies, I apologize for the interruption. We've encountered an incident up ahead. It will take some time to clear the tracks, but I assure you there is no immediate danger. Please remain calm." The conductor's words, though reassuring, did little to ease the unease that had settled in the compartment. Mrs. Carrington sat rigidly, her hands tightly gripping the armrests of her seat as if to steady herself, but Miss Marple could see the shift in her demeanour. The woman's composure was cracking. She was afraid, terribly afraid. I can't stay here," Mrs. Carrington stammered, her voice rising slightly. "Please, Miss Marple, I need to leave this train." "I can't stay. They'll find me." "Mrs. Carrington," Miss Marple said calmly, yet firmly, her voice holding a quiet authority. "You need to stay calm. There's no reason to jump to conclusions. Whatever you fear, running won't solve it." But Mrs. Carrington was already standing, her face flushed with panic. She moved swiftly toward the door of the compartment, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. "I can't wait any longer," she insisted, her voice breaking. "Please, you don't understand. He'll come for me. He'll find me." Miss Marple rose from her seat with deliberate slowness, her gaze never leaving Mrs. Carrington. She walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. She could just make out the silhouette of the train conductor, speaking to a few other passengers further down the platform. The stop was temporary, she realized. Whatever had caused the delay, it wasn't a serious emergency. But Mrs. Carrington's frantic behavior was another matter altogether. "Mrs. Carrington, you're not thinking clearly," Miss Marple said gently. though her voice carried a firmness that stopped the woman in her tracks. "Please sit down. If you truly believe someone is coming for you, it's better to stay where you are. Running won't help." But Mrs. Carrington shook her head vigorously, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "He's already here," she muttered under her breath. "I can feel it. He's close. They'll know where I am." They always know. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Something about the way Mrs. Carrington spoke struck a chord. It wasn't just fear, there was something else there. She seemed to know with unsettling certainty that the danger wasn't just hypothetical, it was imminent. A sudden sharp knock on the door interrupted the tension. The door swung open, revealing the figure of Thomas Gregory standing in the hallway. His presence seemed to fill the space with an almost oppressive weight. He was looking directly at Mrs. Carrington, a cold, calculating smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Well, well, what have we here?" he said, his voice smooth but laced with something darker. His gaze flicked to Miss Marple for a moment before returning to the frightened woman in front of him. "I had a feeling we would meet again." Mrs. Carrington froze, her eyes wide with terror. "No," she whispered, backing away from him. "Stay away from me. Please." Miss Marple had been prepared for this moment, but even she couldn't have predicted the way Gregory would appear so suddenly, so deliberately. He wasn't just a man on the hunt for a package, he was here for the woman herself. "Don't worry, Mrs. Carrington," Miss Marple said, her tone unwavering as she stepped forward to position herself between the two. "I'm sure we can come to some sort of understanding." Gregory's smile faded into something sharper. "You don't know who you're dealing with, old woman," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can stop me? I've been patient, but patience is wearing thin." Now step aside. Mrs. Carrington's face was ashen, and her body trembled as though she might collapse at any moment. The woman had become completely undone in the face of Gregory's arrival. She glanced toward the door again, looking for an escape that wasn't there. But Miss Marple remained steadfast, her gaze calm but piercing as she locked eyes with Gregory. "I suggest you leave, Mr. Gregory," she said firmly. "You are not welcome here." For a moment, the two stood in a silent standoff, the tension so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Then, with a quick, sharp movement, Gregory's expression hardened and he took a step back. "This isn't over, Miss Marple," he said in a low growl. "And neither is it over for you, Mrs. Carrington. Don't think for a second that you can escape." With that, he turned and stalked off down the corridor, his footsteps fading into the distance. The door to their compartment slammed shut, leaving Miss Marple and Mrs. Carrington standing in the wake of the encounter. Mrs. Carrington sank into her seat, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her hands were trembling uncontrollably, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Why didn't you let me leave?" she gasped. "He'll kill me." "He'll do worse than that." Miss Marple stepped toward her, her voice soft and reassuring, though the wheels in her mind were already turning, piecing together the final elements of the puzzle. "You don't have to face this alone, Mrs. Carrington. But you must tell me everything. What is it that he really wants?" For a long moment, Mrs. Carrington simply stared at her, as if unsure whether to trust the older woman. But eventually she nodded slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "The package. It's not just documents, Miss Marple. It's a weapon that can destroy everything. And it's all in the hands of someone who's already betrayed me." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat, and her thoughts raced. She had known there was more to this story, but this revelation changed everything. The game was no longer about a set of documents. It was about a much more dangerous game of power, betrayal, and survival. And now, the pieces were finally falling into place. Chapter 5. A shocking discovery. The tension in the compartment was almost suffocating. Miss Marple's sharp mind worked at a rapid pace as she processed everything that had just transpired. Gregory's sudden appearance, Mrs. Carrington's fearful breakdown, and the cryptic mention of the package being more than just documents. It was all building to something far more dangerous than Miss Marple had anticipated. Whatever the woman was hiding, it was no longer just about financial records or blackmail. There was something far more sinister involved. As the train rumbled onward, Miss Marple glanced at her watch. They had been stopped for over 20 minutes now, but the faint murmurs of passengers in the distance gave no indication of what was happening. The young conductor had assured them that there was no immediate danger, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that the situation was far more urgent than anyone was letting on. Mrs. Carrington, now seated and visibly trembling, clutched her bag in her lap as though it were a lifeline. Her eyes flickered toward the door every few moments, and her breaths came in shallow, uneven gasps. She was clearly in a state of panic, unable to calm herself enough to speak coherently. Miss Marple, who had seen her fair share of desperate souls in her time, knew that in moments like these, it was important to act swiftly and with purpose. She needed to understand everything, every last detail, before the situation escalated any further. "Mrs. Carrington," Miss Marple said in a calm, measured voice, "I understand that you are frightened, but I need you to focus. You mentioned that the package contained something more than just documents, something dangerous. What do you mean by that?" Mrs. Carrington's eyes darted nervously toward the door again, as if expecting Gregory to burst in at any moment. Her voice trembled as she spoke. It's not just the documents," she whispered, barely audible. "It's a key. An actual key, Miss Marple. A key that unlocks something hidden. Something that could destroy everything." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Destroy everything. What exactly are you talking about, Mrs. Carrington? What does this key unlock?" The woman hesitated for a moment, her lips trembling as though the words were stuck in her throat. Finally, she spoke in a strained whisper. "It unlocks a safe deposit box, one that holds information that could ruin entire governments. It's the proof of a conspiracy, Miss Marple. A conspiracy that goes all the way to the top. A conspiracy." Miss Marple's mind immediately flashed to the earlier details of the case, the money laundering, the blackmail, and Gregory's sudden interest in Mrs. Carrington. She could see now that this was far bigger than she had initially thought. This wasn't just about a personal vendetta or criminal activity. It was about power, the kind of power that could topple nations. "But how did you get involved in something like this?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but probing. Mrs. Carrington's face crumpled, her eyes filling with tears. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she choked out. "I was just trying to do my job. I was hired as an accountant, a simple job at first. But then I started noticing things, strange things, transactions that didn't add up, money moving through accounts that shouldn't have been. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew it wasn't right. And then they came to me. They said they needed me to help them cover it up, and I couldn't say no. I was too afraid of what would happen if I did." Miss Marple listened intently, her mind piecing together the fragments of Mrs. Carrington's story. And Gregory? Was he involved in this from the start? "Yes," Mrs. Carrington whispered. "He was the one who recruited me. He promised me it would be temporary, that I'd just be helping with a few financial reports. But it kept growing. The more I learned, the deeper I got involved. I thought I could back out, but I couldn't. And now they want me to disappear. They want to get rid of me, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's heart went out to the woman. She could see the torment in her eyes, the weight of guilt and fear pressing down on her. But Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. The package, the key, and the conspiracy were the key to unraveling the entire mystery. "Mrs. Carrington," Miss Marple said, her voice firm but kind. "You have to trust me. The more you hold on to this secret, the more dangerous it becomes, for you and for everyone involved. You need to tell me everything. What's in the package? What's in that safe deposit box?" Mrs. Carrington's eyes flickered to the bag in her lap. Her hands shook as she clutched it tighter. "I can't," she whispered. "If Gregory or his people find out, they'll kill me." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but insistent. "And if you don't tell me, Mrs. Carrington, what will happen to you then? Gregory is already here. He's already found you. The longer you keep hiding, the worse it will be. You have to let me help you." For a long moment, Mrs. Carrington said nothing, her eyes darting nervously around the compartment. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's all connected," she said. "The package contains the key to a bank account, a secret account that holds billions of dollars, but it's not just money. It's information, evidence of illegal arms deals, drug trafficking, and even ties to government officials. It's the smoking gun, Miss Marple, the evidence that proves everything, and it's all tied to Gregory and his associates. If it gets out, it will bring down entire governments. People will lose everything. The world will change." Miss Marple sat back, her mind whirling. The scope of the conspiracy was much larger than she had imagined. This was no ordinary crime. It was a global operation that threatened to expose the darkest corners of society. And Gregory wasn't just a blackmailer. He was a part of something much bigger, something far more dangerous. But there was one thing Miss Marple knew. She couldn't let Mrs. Carrington face this alone. Not now. Not when the stakes were this high. "Mrs. Carrington," Miss Marple said softly, her voice calm but filled with resolve. "You're not alone anymore. We will get through this, I promise you. But you have to trust me completely. We need to get that package to the right people, before Gregory does." At that moment, the train lurched forward again, the sound of the engine starting to hum once more. Miss Marple stood up, walking toward the door and peering out into the dimly lit corridor. The train had resumed its journey. "Stay close," Miss Marple said, turning to face the woman. "I'll handle this, but we need to move quickly." The two women exchanged a brief look. Mrs. Carrington's eyes filled with both fear and hope. She had finally trusted Miss Marple with the truth, and now there was no turning back. Gregory was still out there, and he would stop at nothing to retrieve the package. The clock was ticking, and the dangerous game they were playing had only just begun. Miss Marple's mind was already racing ahead, calculating the next steps. There were still too many pieces of the puzzle to fit together, and she had no idea how deep the conspiracy truly went. But one thing was certain. The answers lay within that package, and it was only a matter of time before everything would come crashing down. Chapter 6. The Man Reappears. The train's gentle sway was the only comfort in the growing tension of the compartment. The light overhead flickered briefly before settling into a steady hum, as if to mirror the frantic thoughts swirling in Miss Marple's mind. She sat quietly across from Mrs. Carrington, whose face was ashen, her eyes flickering nervously toward the door every few moments, as though expecting someone to appear at any moment. Despite the assurances from the conductor that the situation was under control, Miss Marple knew the danger was far from over. Gregory's presence on the train, his cryptic threats and the discovery of the package had only escalated the stakes. Miss Marple glanced at her watch. They had been stopped for nearly half an hour, yet nothing had been explained in any detail. The conductor had seemed nervous, but the way he'd hurried off without offering any concrete information had left Miss Marple with the unsettling feeling that there was more to this delay than he was letting on. The air was thick with uncertainty, but Miss Marple remained as calm as ever. She had a feeling that the next few hours would reveal more than she could have ever anticipated. It was a puzzle, one she intended to solve, no matter how complicated it seemed. Mrs. Carrington shifted nervously in her seat, the silence growing between them. She was too afraid to speak, but Miss Marple knew she had to keep the woman talking. The more she spoke, the more pieces would fall into place. But Mrs. Carrington seemed lost in her own thoughts, her hands once again twisting the clasp of her bag in an almost frantic motion. Then suddenly the door to their compartment slid open. Miss Marple looked up, expecting to see the conductor or another passenger, but instead, her gaze was met by none other than Thomas Gregory himself. He stood there, framed by the doorway, his dark eyes scanning the compartment with an unsettling intensity. He had changed little since their first encounter, still the same sharp, calculating demeanour, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the dimly lit surroundings. His gaze immediately landed on Mrs. Carrington, his lips curling into a faint, cold smile. "I see we're still playing the waiting game, Mrs. Carrington," Gregory said, his voice smooth but with an underlying edge. "I must say, I'm surprised you've managed to stay so calm." Mrs. Carrington, who had been sitting stiffly in her seat, now flinched as though struck by his words. Her eyes darted to Miss Marple, as though silently pleading for help, but Miss Marple remained silent, her mind already at work, analysing Gregory's every word and action. Gregory's eyes flicked to Miss Marple, and for a moment he seemed to appraise her as though trying to gauge her level of understanding. His lips tightened, and then he spoke again, his tone dripping with condescension. "And you, Miss Marple, is it? I must admit I didn't expect you to be involved in this little drama. But it seems you've caught the attention of some very dangerous people." Miss Marple remained unfazed, her gaze steady as she responded. "I'm simply trying to understand what's going on, Mr. Gregory. Perhaps you'd be kind enough to enlighten me." A flicker of annoyance passed through Gregory's features, but he quickly masked it with his trademark calm. "Ah, a woman of wit," he said with a mocking bow. "But I'm afraid you won't find the answers you're looking for here, Miss Marple." "Not unless you know where to look." Miss Marple's mind was racing now. Gregory's presence, so suddenly and unexpectedly, only added to the complexity of the situation. It wasn't just about the documents or the key anymore, it was about power. Gregory wasn't just after a package, he was after control. He wanted to intimidate Mrs. Carrington into submission, and he thought he could do the same to Miss Marple. He took a step forward, moving closer to Mrs. Carrington, who instinctively recoiled. "You really thought you could escape, didn't you?" Gregory continued, his voice low and venomous. "But there's nowhere to run, not anymore. You belong to me, whether you like it or not." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. She could see the tension in Mrs. Carrington's face, the fear that had taken root and refused to let go. But there was something else, a flicker of defiance, perhaps. Mrs. Carrington wasn't entirely broken yet. "You're wrong, Mr. Gregory," Miss Marple said evenly, her voice laced with quiet confidence. "No one belongs to you." "Not anymore." Gregory's expression shifted, the smile fading into something darker. For the first time, Miss Marple saw a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. It was a crack in his otherwise flawless facade, and she knew that was something to exploit. "Is that so?" Gregory asked, his voice sharp. He took another step closer to Mrs. Carrington, who shrank back further into her seat. "And how do you propose to stop me, Miss Marple? You're not in control here. You're just a bystander, an old woman who can't possibly understand what's really at stake." Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. She had faced men like him before, men who believed themselves invincible, untouchable. She knew exactly how to handle them. "I understand more than you think, Mr. Gregory," she said calmly. "I've been in situations far more complicated than this, and I've always found a way to bring the truth to light." Gregory's eyes narrowed, But Miss Marple stood her ground. She had the distinct feeling that this encounter was no mere coincidence. It was part of a larger game, and she was finally beginning to understand the rules. Gregory was a man used to control, to manipulation. But Miss Marple had a different kind of power, the power of observation, the power of knowing people, of understanding their weaknesses for a brief moment. The train seemed to hold its breath, the stillness hanging heavy in the air. Then, without warning, Gregory turned and walked toward the door of the compartment, his hand on the handle. But before leaving, he glanced back at Mrs. Carrington, his expression cold and calculating. "This isn't over," he said, his voice a low threat. "I'll be watching." And with that, he was gone, leaving behind an almost tangible tension in the air. The door slid shut behind him, and the compartment felt emptier somehow. The weight of his words lingered, heavy and foreboding. Miss Marple turned her attention back to Mrs. Carrington, who was sitting motionless, her eyes wide with fear. She had been holding her breath, as though afraid to exhale in case Gregory returned. But now she slowly released a shaky breath and glanced up at Miss Marple. "What now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Miss Marple took a seat across from her, her mind already moving at full speed. The game had just changed. Gregory had made his move, but he had underestimated her. He had underestimated the fact that she was not a bystander. She was the one who would uncover the truth. And now, Miss Marple had a clear target. "We move forward," Miss Marple replied, her voice steady and determined. "We stay calm, and we make our next move carefully. Gregory is not the only one playing this game. We have our own cards to play, and we'll use them wisely." Mrs. Carrington's eyes flickered with a mix of fear and hope. "And what if he comes back?" "Then we'll be ready for him," Miss Marple said, her tone resolute. "This game is far from over, Mrs. Carrington. In fact, it's only just begun." The train continued to roll through the night, its rhythmic motion a constant in the growing uncertainty. Miss Marple's thoughts were already racing, piecing together the next steps in the puzzle. Gregory might have made his move, but Miss Marple was in control now. At least, she intended to be. She had no intention of letting him, or anyone else, win. Chapter 7. The Conversation. The atmosphere in the compartment had shifted dramatically after Gregory's visit. The train's usual rhythmic hum seemed louder now, more intrusive, as though even the train itself was complicit in the tension that hung in the air. Miss Marple sat silently, her mind racing with the recent events. Gregory had left, but his words echoed in her mind. "I'll be watching." A threat, yes, but also a challenge. And Miss Marple never shied away from a challenge. Mrs. Carrington, still visibly shaken, sat across from Miss Marple, her hands wringing the fabric of her dress. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, but she had calmed down slightly since Gregory's departure. She wasn't crying anymore, but the fear was still there, etched into every line of her face. Her eyes flickered to the door every few moments, as if expecting Gregory to burst back in. Miss Marple, on the other hand, was entirely composed. She was used to threats, to danger. She had seen it all before. Gregory may have been trying to control the situation with intimidation, but Miss Marple knew that true power came from knowledge, and it was knowledge that she needed now, more than ever. "Mrs. Carrington," Miss Marple said softly, her voice breaking the oppressive silence. "I know this is difficult for you, but I must ask you to tell me everything. You mentioned a conspiracy earlier, something that could bring down governments. This is more than just a personal vendetta, isn't it?" Mrs. Carrington blinked rapidly, as if startled by the directness of Miss Marple's question. Her gaze dropped to her hands, which were still trembling. She swallowed hard before looking up, meeting Miss Marple's steady gaze. "I've told you as much as I can," Mrs. Carrington whispered, her voice hoarse. "But there's more. So much more." Gregory isn't just after me. He's after something much bigger. That package. It's not just a set of documents, Miss Marple. It's a key to something that could change everything. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. A key to what, exactly? Mrs. Carrington hesitated for a long moment, her lips pressed tightly together as if considering whether she should reveal more. Finally she spoke, her voice barely audible. It's a list of people. Powerful people. The kind of people who can make or break entire countries with a single phone call. People who have their hands in everything, arms deals, drug trafficking, money laundering. The kind of things that no one should ever know about. She paused, her eyes flickering with fear. And Gregory, he's one of them. He's not just some petty criminal, Miss Marple. He's a cog in a much larger machine. And he's willing to do anything to protect it. Miss Marple's mind raced as she processed this new information. This wasn't just about financial crime or blackmail anymore. This was about corruption at the highest levels. And Gregory, the man who had been so calm and calculating, was a part of it. But who else was involved? And what would they do to protect themselves if they found out Mrs. Carrington had the key to their secrets? Do you have the list? Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but insistent. Mrs. Carrington nodded, her eyes wide with fear. It's in the package. But that's not all. The list. It's the tip of the iceberg. There are other things, other people who are involved, people who are far more dangerous than Gregory, if they find out what I have. Her voice trailed off, and her hands shook so violently that the leather bag nearly slipped from her lap. Miss Marple took a deep breath, weighing the situation. The truth was becoming clearer now, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Mrs. Carrington had the key, the list, the proof, but she was terrified to trust anyone. And Miss Marple knew that with someone like Gregory lurking in the shadows, trust was a rare commodity. Mrs. Carrington, Miss Marple said gently, her voice firm but kind, I understand how you feel. But you can't run forever. You need to make a choice. Will you face the consequences of what you know? Or will you let Gregory and his associates control you for the rest of your life? Mrs. Carrington's face twisted in pain. I can't. She took a shaky breath. I'm so scared, Miss Marple. I've already lost so much. If I give this information to the police, they'll kill me. They'll kill everyone I love. And if I keep it, they'll find me anyway. I've been running for months and they're always just one step behind. Miss Marple studied her carefully, her thoughts calculating. The woman was desperate, torn between the fear of what might happen if she trusted the wrong person and the fear of living the rest of her life in hiding. But Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. The only way to take back control was to face the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. You've already made it this far, Miss Marple said quietly. You came to me because you want help, Mrs. Carrington, and I'm here to help you, but I can't do it alone. You need to tell me everything you know, the people involved, the locations, the full extent of what's at stake. Only then can we figure out how to bring this to an end. For a long moment, Mrs. Carrington didn't speak. Her hands rested in her lap, the tremors subsiding ever so slightly, but the fear still radiated from her. She was standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down into the abyss. Miss Marple could see the struggle in her eyes, the battle between the overwhelming fear of the unknown and the glimmer of hope that Miss Marple offered. Finally, Mrs. Carrington spoke, her voice small but resolute. You're right, she whispered. I can't run anymore. I've been running for so long and I'm tired. I can't keep hiding from this. Miss Marple gave her a soft smile. That's the first step, Mrs. Carrington. Facing the truth. Now, we need to make sure that truth reaches the right people before Gregory or anyone else can stop us. Mrs. Carrington nodded, her eyes now filled with a mix of fear and determination. For the first time since Miss Marple had met her, there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was something that Miss Marple could work with. "Tell me everything, Mrs. Carrington," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. "The more I know, the better chance we have of stopping this before it's too late." And so Mrs. Carrington began to speak, slowly at first, her voice trembling, but as she spoke, the floodgates opened. She recounted everything, every detail, every name, every place that could lead to unraveling the conspiracy. Miss Marple listened closely, taking mental notes, her sharp mind piecing together the puzzle. This was no ordinary crime. This was a web of corruption, power, and violence, and it was going to take every ounce of Miss Marple's skill to bring it down. As the conversation continued, Miss Marple knew that the stakes were higher than ever. Gregory was still out there, and the danger was far from over. But now, for the first time, Miss Marple had the information she needed to turn the tide. The truth was out, and it was time to fight back. Chapter 8. The Hidden Room. The train was once again cruising steadily through the night, its rhythmic chug reverberating through the walls of the compartment, but Miss Marple felt a growing sense of urgency gnawing at her. After hours of conversation, Mrs. Carrington had revealed enough to piece together the edges of a dangerous conspiracy, one that threatened far more than just her own safety. But despite the revelations, one question still lingered unanswered. What was the true nature of the package she held so tightly? Miss Marple had listened patiently to Mrs. Carrington's fears and confessions, but her mind was far ahead of the conversation. The more Mrs. Carrington spoke, the more she realized that Gregory was not just the shadowy figure he appeared to be. He was merely a piece of the puzzle, a cog in a much larger and more dangerous machine. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more she became certain that the package Mrs. Carrington was guarding held something that could expose a deep, far-reaching corruption. But what exactly? And why was Gregory so desperate to get his hands on it? As Mrs. Carrington sat quietly beside her, visibly drained from the weight of her confessions, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had already seen the faintest glimpse of the package, small, unassuming, and yet undeniably crucial to everything. But the stakes had risen since the last confrontation with Gregory. He had left with a promise to return, and that promise had the distinct ring of inevitability. Just as Miss Marple was about to speak, a soft, almost imperceptible sound interrupted her thoughts. The faintest of footsteps echoed down the corridor outside their compartment, too slow, too deliberate to be anyone in a hurry. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. It was subtle, but it was enough to catch her attention. She glanced at Mrs. Carrington, who was still slouched, her hands resting nervously in her lap, and then she turned back to the door. "Mrs. Carrington," Miss Marple said softly, her tone barely above a whisper, "I think we have company." "Stay quiet." The train car was still and silent again, the light above flickering momentarily before resuming its steady glow. Miss Marple listened closely. There it was again, the quiet shuffle of footsteps. This time they were closer. Someone was approaching their compartment. For a moment nothing happened. The door remained still, but Miss Marple knew this silence would not last long. She stood, moving with quiet precision, gliding over to the small compartment window and carefully peeking outside. Her suspicion was confirmed. There, standing just out of view of the door, was a figure in a dark suit. It was Gregory. He wasn't alone. Miss Marple could just make out the vague silhouette of another man standing beside him, both men appearing deep in conversation. She could not hear their words, but she didn't need to. She already knew enough to understand that they were up to something. And Gregory's visit was no coincidence. "Stay calm," Miss Marple whispered to Mrs. Carrington, whose fear was palpable. She had seen the way Mrs. Carrington's fingers clenched around the edges of the bag, her knuckles white with anxiety. "I can't," Mrs. Carrington started, her voice barely audible. "I can't keep running, Miss Marple. I'm not ready. What if they get to the package first?" Miss Marple gave her a reassuring look, though her mind was already working at lightning speed. Gregory was no fool. He'd realized that Mrs. Carrington had some kind of advantage, and she suspected that the bag contained more than just evidence. Gregory knew that he was close, and Miss Marple suspected that he would stop at nothing to find out exactly what that key unlocked. Before Miss Marple could respond, the door to their compartment suddenly slid open. Gregory's figure filled the doorway, his presence as imposing as ever. He was flanked by a tall man whose face was obscured by shadows, but his posture was unmistakably tense. This was no friendly visit. The man with Gregory had the look of someone who had been expecting this moment for a long time. Gregory's lips curled into a thin, sardonic smile. "Ah, Mrs. Carrington," he said in a voice that was both mocking and threatening. "It seems we're getting closer, don't you think?" Miss Marple's gaze never wavered, her composure never slipping. "Closer to what, Mr. Gregory?" she asked coolly, her voice steady. "More threats? More intimidation? I'm afraid it won't work. You've underestimated us both." Gregory's smile faltered for a brief moment. "Underestimate?" He laughed lightly, though there was little humor in the sound. "I think you're the one who's underestimating the situation, Miss Marple. But I'm not here for a friendly chat. I'm here to make sure this all ends one way or another." Before Miss Marple could respond, the man with Gregory stepped into the compartment, his gaze locking onto Mrs. Carrington. He didn't say a word, but his presence was enough. The way he stood there, looming over her, reminded Miss Marple of a predator about to pounce on its prey. Mrs. Carrington froze, her eyes wide with terror. Gregory raised a hand, signaling his associate to step aside. "You've been hiding something, haven't you?" he said, his voice low, almost conversational. "It's time to give it up." Miss Marple remained calm, but her mind was already racing. She knew what Gregory was after, the package, the information, the key. But what exactly did it unlock? What could be so valuable that it had Gregory, and whoever he was working for, so desperate? "We've been patient, Mrs. Carrington," Gregory continued, "but patience has limits. Give us the package." Now, for a moment the silence stretched. Mrs. Carrington looked like she was about to collapse, her hand hovering over the bag, her fingers trembling. Miss Marple stepped forward, her presence commanding. "Gregory, I suggest you step away from Mrs. Carrington," Miss Marple said firmly. "I'm not going to let you intimidate her any further. You've already done enough damage." Gregory's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might lash out. But instead he took a step back, his expression tightening. "You think you can stop this? You think you can stop me?" He glanced at his companion, who gave a small nod, as though confirming the unspoken order. "Fine. Have it your way. We'll get what we need, one way or another." Without another word, Gregory turned sharply on his heel, his companion following close behind. But before he reached the door, Gregory paused and looked back at Miss Marple. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice tinged with a cold promise. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Miss Marple. None of you do." The door slammed shut behind them, and the silence returned to the compartment. Mrs. Carrington was visibly shaking, but Miss Marple didn't take her eyes off the door. She knew Gregory hadn't given up. He was playing a larger game, and this was only the beginning. "Mrs. Carrington," Miss Marple said quietly, "we need to act quickly. The package is more important than we realized. They're willing to kill to get it. We need to find out what it contains before they do." Mrs. Carrington's eyes filled with unshed tears, but she nodded. "I don't know if I can keep going." But I'll do whatever it takes. I have to stop them." Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her resolve remained unshaken. "Then let's finish this together. But we need to stay ahead of them. And that means getting to the hidden room." At the mention of the hidden room, Mrs. Carrington looked startled. "Hidden room?" she whispered, as though the idea hadn't fully dawned on her. Miss Marple's voice was steady, her mind already racing toward the next step in their plan. "We need to find the place where they keep their secrets. You know it exists, don't you?" Mrs. Carrington's expression shifted from fear to determination. "I know where it is. But we have to be careful. If we go there now, we might never come back." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet confidence. "Then we'll go now, and we'll make sure you come back. We're not running anymore. We're going to take control." The game had changed once again. Now it was time to uncover the final truth, before it was too late. Chapter 9. The Twist. The train had been moving steadily for some time now, but the silence that hung over the compartment felt heavier than ever. Miss Marple sat across from Mrs. Carrington, whose demeanour had shifted. No longer trembling in fear, she was now quietly resolute, as if the events of the last few hours had transformed her. The confession was out, the stakes clearer, but there was still the matter of what to do next. Gregory's threat had not been idle, and Miss Marple knew they could not afford to wait much longer. Time was slipping away, and with it the possibility of stopping whatever dangerous game was unfolding. Mrs. Carrington had, at long last, revealed the truth. There was no turning back now. Gregory and his associates were not just criminals. They were part of something far larger, something international, involving corruption and power at the highest levels. The package that Mrs. Carrington carried, which seemed so innocuous at first, was in fact a key to unravelling a web of secrets that could bring down entire governments. And yet, even with this knowledge, Miss Marple was not sure if they were any closer to an answer than when they first boarded the train. One thing was certain: the mystery had deepened. Gregory's cryptic warning and the shadowy threats of those behind him loomed large. But it was not just about the package anymore. It was about what they could do to stop it from falling into the wrong hands, before the truth was buried forever. The train's soft whistle broke the tension, signalling another stop ahead. Miss Marple glanced out of the window, but the landscape beyond was nothing but a blur in the darkness. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows over the world outside. There was something unsettling about the stillness, the way the night seemed to hang suspended, like the calm before a storm. The sudden sound of footsteps in the corridor caught Miss Marple's attention. She stiffened, her senses alert. It was not the hurried pace of the conductor this time. It was deliberate, slow, as if someone was trying to remain unnoticed. Miss Marple's eyes darted to Mrs. Carrington, who had grown unusually still, her face pale again as she clutched the bag tighter in her lap. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," Mrs. Carrington whispered, her voice trembling once again. "Gregory won't stop. He'll keep coming. And then—" Before she could finish her sentence, the door to their compartment slid open, interrupting her. Miss Marple's hand instinctively moved to her purse, where she kept a small concealed weapon for self-defense. But as the figure in the doorway stepped into the compartment, her hand froze and her heart skipped a beat. It was not Gregory, not his cold, imposing presence, nor the tall man who had accompanied him. Instead, it was someone Miss Marple hadn't expected to see, someone she had thought was long gone. It was the conductor, but something was off. The conductor's usual uniform was rumpled, his face drawn and pale, as though he hadn't slept in days. His eyes, usually friendly and professional, were filled with something else now, something darker, almost fearful. The faintest tremor ran through his hands as he closed the door behind him, locking it with a soft click. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and strained. "We need to talk." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind quickly assessing the situation. The conductor had never been more than a figure of routine, someone she barely gave a second thought to. Yet now, his presence here, in this compartment, felt like a harbinger of something far more dangerous. "What is it?" Miss Marple asked coolly, her voice steady. She had long learned not to reveal too much in such a situation, especially when dealing with someone who was clearly on edge. "Why are you here?" The conductor took a step forward, but not too close. He glanced at Mrs. Carrington, whose face had gone even paler at the sight of him. His eyes shifted nervously to the door again, as though checking that no one else was listening. "I'm sorry, but I couldn't keep quiet anymore," he said, lowering his voice even further. "I should have told you sooner, but I didn't know who to trust. But now I can't keep it to myself any longer." Miss Marple's instincts told her that this wasn't just a random confession, it was a pivotal moment. Whatever the conductor had to say, it could change everything. "Go on," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm, urging him to continue. The conductor swallowed hard, clearly struggling with something. Then, as if the weight of his decision was too much to bear, he finally spoke. "I'm the one who set this up," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the door again, the fear evident in his posture. "It was me. I was the one who alerted Gregory. I told him where to find Mrs. Carrington. I didn't mean for it to go this far, but I had no choice. They threatened me, Miss Marple. They said if I didn't help, they'd kill my family." The words hit like a cold slap, but Miss Marple didn't flinch. She had seen this kind of desperation before. People caught between loyalty and fear, drawn into something far beyond their control. But there was more to the story, and she wasn't going to let him off so easily. "You've been helping Gregory?" Miss Marple asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and sharp curiosity. "You betrayed her? And you brought him here?" The conductor nodded, his face flushed with guilt. "I didn't want to. But they had my family. They said I had no choice. And then they told me about the package, what it could do, what it could uncover. I didn't realize the full scope of it until it was too late." Miss Marple felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just about a man after a package anymore. It was about lives, about families, being used as pawns in a game that was much bigger than she could have imagined. The stakes were not just political or criminal, they were deeply personal. "But now," the conductor continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "it's worse. I've seen them. They're here, in this very train. Not just Gregory. There's someone else, someone much worse. They're going to make sure that package never sees the light of day, and they'll stop at nothing to make sure it stays hidden." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, and she leaned in closer, sensing the turning tide. "Who are they? Who else is involved?" The conductor glanced quickly at Mrs. Carrington, as if to gauge her reaction, before answering in a voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just criminals, Miss Marple. It's not just people trying to cover up their tracks. It's people with power. People who have control over everything. Political figures, business magnates, high-ranking officials. It's a network that spans continents." Miss Marple's mind was racing, piecing together the fragments. This was no ordinary conspiracy. It was an international web of corruption and power, spanning the highest levels of society. And Mrs. Carrington, despite her fear, was the key to unlocking it all. The package contained not just evidence, it held the power to expose everything. Mrs. Carrington, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke, her voice trembling. "If they find out I've told you, if they find out you know, they'll come for you too. They won't stop." Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile, though her heart was heavy with the weight of what was unfolding. "Don't worry, Mrs. Carrington. We've already come too far, and we're not turning back now." The conductor, still visibly shaken, nodded slowly as if trying to reconcile the words he had just spoken with the consequences they would soon face. "I'm sorry for what I did," he whispered, "but I can't let them win. I can't keep living with this." Miss Marple's gaze was hard now, her thoughts clear. "We have one chance to stop this. We have to find out what's in that package before they get to it." The game had just taken a dramatic turn. They were no longer just playing defense. They were going on the offense. Gregory and his associates might think they controlled the situation, but Miss Marple was determined to turn the tables. The train rolled on through the night, but now every passing mile felt like it was leading them closer to the heart of the conspiracy. Time was running out. The next move was crucial, and Miss Marple was ready. Chapter 10. The True Culprit. The train had long since left the station, its wheels clicking steadily over the tracks, but the compartment still felt like a pressure cooker about to burst. Miss Marple could feel the tension building, the atmosphere in the compartment charged with a sense of urgency. The conductor's confession had changed everything. No longer were they dealing with just a couple of criminals trying to protect their secrets. They were tangled in a much larger web of corruption and danger that reached to the highest echelons of power. Mrs. Carrington was still shaken from the revelation that the conductor, someone she had trusted, had betrayed her. She sat across from Miss Marple, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Miss Marple had seen this kind of despair before, but she could tell that Mrs. Carrington was beginning to understand something important. It wasn't just fear of Gregory and his associates anymore. It was fear for the very truth she was holding in that unassuming bag. The package was more than just a set of documents. It was the key to exposing a vast and dangerous conspiracy. Despite the chilling revelation, Miss Marple remained calm. She could sense that the next few hours would be pivotal. They were close, so very close, to unraveling the full extent of the conspiracy. But the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. Gregory would stop at nothing to get his hands on the package. Miss Marple had no illusions about what he was capable of. Yet, in the face of such danger, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. It wasn't over. "Mrs. Carrington," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm, "we need to take action now. We need to know exactly what's in that package before Gregory does. The longer we wait, the closer we get to losing everything." Mrs. Carrington's eyes flickered nervously toward the door. She was still grappling with the realization that the conductor, someone who had seemed so trustworthy, was involved in the scheme. "But I don't know what to do, Miss Marple," she whispered. "If we expose everything, they'll kill me. They'll kill you too." Miss Marple shook her head, her eyes focused and determined. "They may try, Mrs. Carrington, but we're not going to let that happen, not if we act quickly. The key to all of this is the information inside that package. It's not just about the documents, it's about what they can do with that information." Mrs. Carrington swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. She started, but her voice faltered. "I never wanted any of this. I thought I was just doing a job, Miss Marple. I didn't realize how deep I was getting involved, how much danger I was really in." "I know," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but resolute. "You were swept into something much bigger than you could ever have imagined. But now, we're going to stop it, and we're going to do it together." The words hung in the air like a quiet promise. Miss Marple had faced far worse than this, but she had never backed down from a challenge. And this conspiracy, was no different. She would bring the truth to light, no matter what it took. Suddenly, a knock at the door made both of them jump. Mrs. Carrington's eyes widened with panic, but Miss Marple remained calm, her sharp gaze flicking toward the door. She wasn't surprised. Gregory wasn't the type to give up easily, and he knew they were getting closer to the truth. This was his last chance to stop them. Miss Marple stood and walked to the door, her footsteps measured and deliberate. As she reached for the handle, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She knew that once the door opened, everything would change. There would be no turning back. She opened the door with quiet precision, her eyes immediately meeting the cold, calculating gaze of Thomas Gregory. Behind him stood the tall man who had been accompanying him earlier, the same one who had given Miss Marple such a disquieting look. His presence was intimidating, but Miss Marple remained unfazed. "Well, Miss Marple," Gregory said, his voice smooth, though there was an undercurrent of irritation in his tone. "It seems we've come to a crossroads, haven't we?" Miss Marple didn't flinch. "I believe we have, Mr. Gregory. And I'm not backing down now." Gregory smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was a smile that spoke of danger, of someone used to getting what they wanted. "You think you're in control, don't you?" he said, taking a step closer. "You think you can stop me? But I'm afraid you're mistaken." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "No, Mr. Gregory, I think you're mistaken." For a moment there was silence between them. The air seemed to crackle with tension, and Miss Marple could see that Gregory was calculating his next move. The man behind him shifted slightly, his eyes never leaving Miss Marple, as though assessing whether she could be a threat. "I've already told you," Gregory said coldly. "This ends one way or another. You can hand over the package and we can part ways. Or we can do this the hard way." Miss Marple stood firm, her gaze unwavering. "You can try to take it by force, but you won't win. This is bigger than you, Gregory. You don't even understand the full extent of what's at stake." Gregory's smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty passing over his face. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Then tell me, Miss Marple, what exactly is at stake?" Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes fixed on his. "The truth, Mr. Gregory. You've been hiding it for too long, and now it's time for it to come out." With that, she reached into her purse and pulled out the package, the small, unassuming leather bag that had become the epicenter of this entire situation. Gregory's eyes immediately locked onto it, and Miss Marple could see the desire in his gaze. He was determined to take it, but he wasn't prepared for what was about to happen. Before Gregory could make a move, Miss Marple turned and handed the package to Mrs. Carrington, who had stood frozen at the back of the compartment watching the confrontation unfold. Mrs. Carrington's eyes widened in shock, but Miss Marple gave her a small, reassuring nod. "You have the key, Mrs. Carrington," Miss Marple said quietly. "Now, you need to make sure it gets to the right people. It's time to end this." Gregory's eyes flicked from the package to Mrs. Carrington, a mixture of rage and disbelief on his face. "No," he shouted. "You don't understand. This isn't just about the package. It's about power, control." Miss Marple met his gaze, her voice calm and steady. "And that's why you'll lose, Gregory. Power isn't about control. It's about the truth, and that's something you'll never have." For a moment, there was silence. Then, without warning, the man behind Gregory lunged forward, but Miss Marple was already 2 steps ahead. She had expected this. With a swift motion, she reached for the small revolver hidden in her purse, pointing it at the man who had tried to advance. "Don't make me use this," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but I will defend myself if necessary." The man froze, his hands raised in surrender. Gregory's eyes widened in shock, and for the first time he seemed to realize that he wasn't in control anymore. "Now," Miss Marple continued, her eyes fixed on Gregory, "you and your associates are going to leave. And if you're smart, you'll stay away." Gregory opened his mouth to retort, but the words died on his lips. For the first time, he seemed to understand that he had lost. With a bitter, defeated glance at Mrs. Carrington, he turned and walked out of the compartment, his companion following silently behind him. The door slid shut with a soft click, and the train seemed to breathe again. The tension, the fear, the game, it was all over. For now. Miss Marple turned back to Mrs. Carrington, who was still holding the package, her hands shaking. "You did it," Miss Marple said quietly. "You've taken the first step." Mrs. Carrington nodded slowly, her expression one of awe and relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "I never could have done it without you." Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes reflecting a quiet satisfaction. "No, Mrs. Carrington, we did it. Together the game was over, but the truth had only just begun to surface.